It's the night of June 4th, 2002, and 14-year-old Elizabeth Smart was in the best mood. Not only had she received 2 awards at her school's middle school graduation ceremony, but her good friend Lori had just invited her to go on summer vacation. Once back home from the graduation, Elizabeth spent the entire night begging her parents to let her go on vacation with Lori. And after hours of pleading, they finally agreed. Elizabeth fell asleep that night feeling so happy. Unfortunately, though, it would be the last good sleep she had for 9 months. The next thing Elizabeth remembers is hearing a man's voice she wasn't familiar with. But she was still in that stage of sleep where you're awake enough to know that something's going on, but still asleep enough to not really comprehend it. She assumed she was dreaming and ignored it. But then she heard the voice again, and this time she knew she wasn't dreaming. The voice said, "I have a knife at your neck. Don't make a sound, get up and come with me." Afraid this man would hurt her little sister, who was literally lying next to her, Elizabeth followed his orders. Together they walked out of the house, through the backyard, up a trail, and then they walked, and they walked, and they walked. They crawled through a narrow ravine, climbed up a mountain, and just as they started to walk back down the mountain, Elizabeth noticed a small piece of land that had been cleared. There was a tent, tarps on the ground, and even tarps in the trees so that no one could see in from above. Now, Elizabeth didn't know it at the time, but her little sister Mary Catherine had also been woken by this man, but paralyzed by fear. She laid still until the man and Elizabeth had left, and as soon as they were gone, she raced to her parents' bedroom. But just before she got to their door, she saw Elizabeth and the man outside and ran back to her room and hid under her bed for 2 hours. Finally, around 4 a.m., she felt brave enough to run back to her parents' room and tell them what had happened. Elizabeth's parents, though, thought Mary Catherine might have been dreaming or had a nightmare and didn't believe her until they saw the bedroom window screen had been cut with a knife. As Elizabeth and her captor arrived at this campsite, a woman dressed in a long, dark robe approached her. She walked straight up to Elizabeth and hugged her. The first thing they had Elizabeth do was go into the tent and change into a robe that looked like the woman's. After some time had passed, she heard the tent door unzip and the abductor walked in. He had changed into the same robe. He looked at Elizabeth and said, "I hereby seal you to me as my wife before God and his angels as my witnesses." Elizabeth screamed no. And the man said, "If you scream out again, I will kill you." The man then sexually assaulted Elizabeth in the tent, an act that would continue 3 to 4 times a day for months upon months. Within days, a $250,000 reward was set for Elizabeth's safe return. Her father, Ed Smart, had been repeatedly questioned and polygraphed by police. A rumor had started swirling that the local milkman, Brett Edmond, was responsible for the kidnapping. And then, about a week after Elizabeth's abduction, a handyman named Richard Ricci was arrested by police and booked on charges of theft after admitting to stealing $3,500 worth of items from the Smart's home. He adamantly denied having anything to do with the kidnapping, though. He was eventually cleared as a suspect in the kidnapping, but not before he died of an aneurysm just weeks after the abduction. 7 weeks after Elizabeth was abducted, her 18-year-old cousin, Jessica Wright, was the target of an attempted kidnapping just like Elizabeth's case. Jessica's bedroom window was cut horizontally and vertically in the middle of the night, and a chair was left beneath the window outside the house. Jessica was awoken at 3 in the morning after pictures on her dresser had fallen down. She looked out the window and saw someone's shadow and took off running to her parents' room. Jessica's dad had actually heard the picture frames fall too, so he ran outside with the dog to try and catch whoever it was, but they were already gone. Elizabeth's days in captivity were long. She spent most of her time being assaulted by her abductor, chained to a tree, or shoved down into a hole that was covered up by boards. Her abductor would often remind her of her purpose, which was to be the first of many virgin brides who would accompany him as he fought the Antichrist, believing fully that he would die and be resurrected, like Jesus. Her abductors changed her name to Esther, forced her to drink alcohol, forced her to take drugs, forced her to look at pornographic magazines, starved her, beat her, constantly threatened to kill her if she tried to escape, and made her eat garbage. And the woman? She was just as bad, just as evil, fully supporting and encouraging the abuse. Multiple times during her abduction, the three went into public together. In fact, 2 months after her abduction, they went to the public library, and the employee at the library felt so uncomfortable that she called police. The officer questioned all three, but her abductor stepped in and said because of religious reasons, women weren't allowed to speak in public and they were not allowed to remove their veils, which was covering their face. So the officer let him go. Elizabeth later said watching that cop turn around and leave was one of the worst feelings she had ever had in her entire life. Then, in October 2002, Elizabeth's little sister Mary Catherine had an epiphany. She knew whose voice she heard the night of the kidnapping. It was Emmanuel. Emmanuel was a man that Elizabeth's mother had encountered 7 months before the abduction. He was standing in the streets of downtown begging for change. In an effort to help him, she offered to pay him to rake leaves and finish a roof repair. In total, Emmanuel was paid for 5 hours of work. Eventually, police learned that Emmanuel was really a 49-year-old man named Brian David Mitchell. Mitchell was a Salt Lake City-born street preacher who had a lifetime of trouble behind him. At the age of 16, he exposed himself to a child and was sent to live at a juvenile home. At 19, he married a woman named Karen. Karen later divorced him, claiming that he not only abused her, but he sexually abused their son. Mitchell then married a woman named Debbie. And later in life, Debbie's daughter said Mitchell had sexually abused her for years. Debbie later divorced Mitchell, and on the day of their divorce, he married his third wife, Wanda Barzee, the monster that helped plan, execute, and hide Elizabeth's abduction. Wanda Barzee, who was 56 at the time, had married Brian David Mitchell, and unlike his other wives, she didn't find Mitchell's mental health an issue at all. 9 months went by. 9 grueling months of torture, daily abuse, starvation, sexual abuse, battling the elements. Until finally, March 12th, 2003. It had been a fairly quiet day for dispatch, so when multiple back-to-back calls came into 911 saying that they had spotted Elizabeth Smart, everybody became excited. As Elizabeth and her captors were walking on the outskirts of town, a cop car pulled up. A few seconds later, a second cop car pulled up, followed by a third and a fourth, and eventually, police were surrounding them. Police started to question the three, but just like every time before, Elizabeth stayed quiet. Until finally, a younger officer said, "I really think we need to question this girl by herself." Elizabeth wasn't stupid though. She had been living with these monsters for 9 months and knew exactly what was expected of her. Not only that, police had been inches away from her previously and totally failed her, so she was petrified that would happen again. So she did what she was told to do, and she lied. But then, after being questioned for what felt like eternity, an officer looked her dead in her eyes and said, "Are you Elizabeth Smart?" She finally broke down crying and said yes. Listen to Elizabeth describe seeing her mother for the first time.
I remember seeing my mom again for the first time. And if I ever had to describe what that felt like in one word, I would say heaven.
Both Brian David Mitchell and Wanda Barzee were arrested. Because of the constant battle regarding Mitchell's mental capacity, it took 8 years for his trial to start. But he was ultimately convicted and sentenced to life in prison. Wanda Barzee was sentenced to just 15 years and was actually granted early release on September 19, 2018. In fact, Wanda Barzee was just in the news again as she was arrested last week for a parole violation after admitting to visiting 2 separate parks where children were playing. Elizabeth Smart is now an advocate for missing persons and victims of sexual assault. She is healing from her ordeal, but as you can imagine, it will be a lifelong journey. Elizabeth married Matthew Gilmore in February of 2012 after meeting at a Mormon mission trip in 2009. They welcomed their first daughter in February 2015, a son in April of 2017, and another baby girl in November 2018.